Hey y'all, Dirty South History, aka Attorney Nassau, coming at you again. And I just wanted to offer up a few more insights on my experiences in South Africa during the mid 90s, uh, particularly in light of what is going on with the current administration and their designating um, white South African farmers as victims of genocide. Okay, I normally talk about the history of the region that I live in America, the American South, but I have to deviate slightly to discuss current events. Normally, I talk about the history. If you haven't figured it out yet, I'm talking about the history of the South as it relates to how it shaped the conditions that we're in now, right? I don't tell you what to think, but I kind of point you in the right direction and see that basically the South won the peace. The Union won the Civil War, but the South won the peace because the basically the myth of the lost cause seems to permeate American society these days and shapes basically what we were taught, at least in my region, what we were taught in school and how America has developed. Because America is still has an undertone of racism, and that undertone is actually rising more comfortably every day, particularly in light of this recent election. Okay, people are feeling more comfortable being racist. That's just the reality. All right, but my experiences growing up here and studying in South Africa allows me to have a unique perspective. And that perspective basically, at least for me, being a lawyer, what we do is we harmonize disparate uh, facts and bring them together so that you can understand a cohesive narrative of what is going on. I don't consider myself a historian. I consider myself uh, um, an attorney who basically tells the story of other people who may not be able to speak for themselves, right? But one thing that an attorney does is basically boils down or distills information in a form that people can easily understand. Okay? And that is one thing that I have realized is that there is a very strong connection in how South Africa developed and whom they followed to get to the point that they ended up at prior to Nelson Mandela's inauguration, okay? Because, believe it or not, South Africa uh, had many of their um, ideas on race and conquest. A lot of them came directly from this place, America. And one of the things that I find interesting is that, you know, uh, white South Africans are alleged to be victims of a genocide and a land grab, but nobody talks about how did they get the land in the first place? How did, Dutch and English migrants end up controlling 90% of the land when they were in power, over 90%? And you can find that information basically through researching their Homelands Acts, and it's something called the Gray Law, right, that they passed in the 1800s, right? Actually, probably prior to that, but I know in the 1800s, okay? Um, Gold and diamonds were discovered in the mid 1800s, and at that time, yeah, that's when this conquest was actually uh, ramped up, okay? Because um, prior to the South African government forming completely, what happened was there was a war between the English and the Dutch. The Dutch were considered Boers. Boer, I think is how you pronounce it, right? And the Dutch basically lost, and they started moving hinterland, right? It was a great migration, and they started moving more into the interiors of the country because the British basically controlled the most important part if you are a seafaring nation, right? And that's the colonies on the coast, right? The Cape Colony and others. So they moved the Dutch inland, and the Dutch encountered native South Africans who had a warrior culture, meaning the Xhosa, if I'm saying that right, and the Zulu. So they fought a lot of wars, but they were wars of conquest. And the Dutch had better weapons. So just like what happened with these nations, Indian nations in America, they conquered them because they wanted that land. And that's what happened in South Africa. It's amazing how the parallels go, that when the American nation, early nation, led by somebody like Andrew Jackson, conquered the southern Indians, they took over their land and they started using it for the benefit of people of European descent. Well, that's similar to what happened in South Africa, right? The way that they ended up with all of this land, I think South African whites make up less than 20% of the South African population as a whole. But they control, to this day right now, well over 70% of that land. And the way that they acquired that land was through colonization and conquest, all right? And they basically forced these native South Africans to off their land and off their natural, or I should say traditional ways of living, which was, raising crops and raising animals, cattle and whatnot, and forced them to become miners in these diamond and gold mines. Forced them like that. That's how they did it in Mexico with native indigenous Indians in Mexico and in the South American areas, right? But here, what they did was they basically took the land, forced these people to become laborers, and if they had land within cities, they would remove them off of those too and put them in what's known as homelands, right? And the homelands were places where things wouldn't grow, but they forced them to be laborers and servants to white South Africans. So I'm going to start doing a series on how the South became the South, and I want you to watch for the parallels and how Southern culture influenced racist South African policies. All right, so stay tuned.